Um, Hello and welcome to the monthly talk series organized by the Chair on Urban Poor and the Law, which has been instituted by the Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty, Alleviation. This is our third talk so far, and we hope to continue to do them every month. The idea of this talk series is to keep these talks open to public in the hope that we eventually build this as a space in Bangalore where we continue to have interesting and thought-provoking conversations on the city. So we are very pleased to have Dr. Sanjeev Routray today amongst us, who'll be speaking about his most recent book. Dr. Sanjeev Routray is an assistant professor in the Institute of Asian Studies, University Brunei, Dar es Salaam. He's a sociologist, anthropologist, critical urbanist, and migration specialist of South Asia and beyond. His area of expertise includes urban poverty, political and legal mobilization, trans-regional migration, and caste and labor market negotiations. In his first book, entitled The Right to be Counted, The Urban Poor and the Politics of Resettlement in Delhi, it is published by Stanford University Press 2022, and that's what he'll be talking to us about today. And he's also currently working on his second book, tentatively titled The Plumbers of Delhi, Migration, Caste, Sociality, and Citizenship in an Occupational Community. And with that,
Thank you. Thank you all for taking the time out to come here. I especially thank Dr. Sushmita Pati for organizing this, along with Dr. Anwesha Ghosh, who could not participate. Is that okay? Can you hear? Can you hear me now? Okay. All right. All right. So it's indeed an honor to give a book talk here. So what I'll do is to present the main findings of my book. So I'll just take 15 or 20 minutes, and then I'll invite Dr. Sushmita Pati to give her comments. So I'll take this opportunity to briefly talk about the main findings of my book, the main argument of my book, and then sort of perhaps get some questions and respond to them for clarifications. The primary aim in this book is to examine how the poor migrants from various parts of India build a house and claim a set of citizenship rights in Delhi, especially in the context of displacement and resettlement of their settlement. The book contributes to scholarly and public debates on the contradiction between state governmentality and the citizenship projects of the poor themselves. In so doing, I explore how the planning process contributes to social suffering, but also the logic of resistance and the cultural idioms of political mobilization, which emanates from the processes of displacement and resettlement in Delhi. In order to compare and contrast the modalities of state calculative governmentality enshrined in the urban restructuring processes and to trace the logics of political mobilization among the urban poor, I have chosen 3 different neighborhoods: a Jhuggi Jhopdi settlement, which I have labeled as Gautam Nagar Jhuggi Jhopdi settlement. And Jhuggi Jhopdis, as you know, are comprised of hutments made up of a variety of materials. I've also chosen a transit camp, which I have designated as Chitapuri Transit Camp, and also a new resettlement camp, which or colony, which I have named Azad Resettlement Colony for ethnographic study. The 3 neighborhoods are all state-recognized settlements. In that, the residents of these neighborhoods possess documents proving residence. In other words, they are relatively well entrenched in the political landscape of the city, compared to the poor in other types of social spaces, such as payments or unrecognized Jhuggi Jhopdi settlements, who are considerably less able to claim housing rights in the city. I formulated the idea of numerical citizenship to make my arguments about the political consciousness and agency or the tactics and counter tactics of the poor. In so doing, I drawn 25 months of ethnographic and documentary research, 22 months between November 2009 and August 2011, and 3 months between June and September 2017 in these three neighborhoods and a range of state institutions. But let me first explain to you what I mean by numerical citizens. Many of Delhi's poor transition from being migrants in the city to residents in unidentified Jhuggi-Jhopdi settlements, to residents in state-recognized Jhuggi-Jhopdi settlements, transit camps, or resettlement, colonies or neighborhoods. Once they settle in a state-recognized Jhuggi, they come under the purview of state regulations and calculations. Their struggles then shape the degree to which they may gain access to sets of entitlements, especially the provision of housing, rudimentary infrastructure, and basic amenities which constitute citizenship in Delhi. Delhi's poor remain embedded in various social, political, and economic relationships, even as they forge and build kinship networks and develop alliances of solidarity across the political and social spectrum in their struggles to gain a foothold in the city. Their overlapping struggles to build jhuggis or hutmen, to obtain access to welfare, and to provide for basic needs, but also to stop displacement, gain eligibility for resettlement, and secure proof documents constitute a distinctive mode of advancing material claims and political belonging in the city. At the core of these struggles lie incremental efforts to gain visibility from the local state. The right to be counted describes this process of claims making as a struggle for numerical citizenship, or the struggle to be counted, or and for a political community of the poor to assert its numerical strength. Struggles over numerical citizenship constitute the systematic, protracted, and incremental process by which the poor become entrenched in the city. It is not merely a politics of presence, as Asif Bayer argues in another context, or the assertion of a right to exist, but also a struggle to be visible, to be identified, to be recognized, and to be made eligible for food, shelter, and basic amenities and infrastructure in the city. Let me now share some of the main theoretical arguments of my book. On one hand, the lives of the poor migrants are constrained by numerous numerical calculations of the state. On the other, the migrants participate, negotiate, and resist the technologies of the state through a myriad counter calculations of citizenship struggles. In this respect, my primary contribution is to illuminate how numerical citizenship struggles address a range of dialectics. The monitoring and surveillance of the poor versus locality building, the technology of enumeration versus counter tactics of enumeration, especially to prove numerical presence in the city, legal classification and categorization versus popular processes of renaming and reclassification, projects of planning and legal erasure versus lived politics of auto-archiving, mnemonic strategies, performances, and speech acts during resistance demonstration. Rather than keeping the state at arm's length, as suggested by James Scott in another context, the poor attempt to embed their citizenship struggles within various structures of the state. In order to be state recognized, a Jhuggi-Jhopdi settlement needs to house at least 50 households to begin with. In building their numerical strength, the poor engage with the vagaries of the police and municipal authorities initially, and then steadily enter into the field of electoral politics to advance citizenship claims. Displaying numerical strength remains an important aspect of mediation in the field of patronage politics. In this regard, the poor struggle to enlist themselves on the electoral roll to be part of this political processes. In asserting numerical strength, the struggle for citizenship is premised on the documentation of a population's numerical presence in the city. The poor become eligible for a panoply of citizenship rights in the city only upon the production of the proof of their presence from a particular date. The poor deploy ingenious strategies to obtain proof documents, fix documentary and inscriptive errors or commies, and context arbitrary methods of classification that divide potential beneficiaries as eligible or ineligible. This also entails processes of authentication and counterfeiting, which contest numerical calculations of eligibility, as well as processes of self-enumeration to challenge state enumerations, which are often deflated numbers. I mean, the state always deflates enumeration numbers, right? So in so doing, the poor document their residence in particular neighborhoods through reconstructing their own biographies and life histories and the life histories of their communities. Numerical citizenship struggles, drawn legal struggles to undermine state classification and categorization. The state enunciation or sanctioning of categories like transit, temporary, illegal, and encroacher not only invest various populations with contradictory meanings, but also determine the legal status of their neighborhood. It then becomes incumbent upon the residents to challenge these categories through renaming and reclassification. The categories of transit and temporary imply their lack of numerical entrenchment in the city. The poor contest legal classification through mundane struggles and performative demonstrations in front of the government offices, street corners, and neighborhoods. For instance, the residents of Sitapuri transit camp renamed their locality after one of the former prime ministers of India and organized a ceremony, a felicitation ceremony, for the unveiling of the stone sign bearing the new name of their neighborhood. The poor systematically auto-archive the events and ceremonies by collecting and storing pictures, newspaper clippings, and other artifacts, which in turn propel their claims for more visibility and a secure foothold in the city. They deploy mnemonic and auto-archiving tactics to recall the past sequence of events to prove legitimate residency in particular neighborhood, which play a significant role in shaping the struggle to be counted. In these demonstrations, which are simultaneously peaceful and militant, the poor make use of their affective ties to manufacture specific cultural idioms of protest. Such performances subvert the imposed categories and subjectivities of illegality and ineligibility and draw upon a repertoire of forms of protest. Numerical citizenship struggles constitute a performative politics that engages various idioms of speech acts and public spectacles to demand recognition, legibility, and entitlement. For instance, the poor organize cultural performances, garland key actors, deliver fiery speeches, and most importantly, mobilize sensations to assert their numerical presence in the city. The cultural idioms and performances provide the ideological impetus to organize, offer an opportunity to build alliances and relationships, and contribute to the reinvention and reinvigoration of community solidarity, especially when the poor are resigned to fate. The rhetorical linguistic expressions and symbolic attacks inform the struggle to be counted in the city. For instance, they carry out the symbolic funeral procession and the last rites of a dead or unresponsive government and organize marches and effigy burning of key actors as public spectacles. My empirical insights concerning everyday political practices and citizenship struggles do not advance a normative theory of citizenship. I consider how the practices of the poor challenge a universal theory of citizenship. This challenge is especially pronounced when the locational disadvantages of poor in various settings call for empirically grounded theorization. In this light, I argue against a fetishization of the state as the dispenser of normative rights as conceptualized in liberal political theory. Instead, I contend that the state is neither the fountain of rule of law and social justice, nor an unaccountable entity from the perspective of the poor. Rather than the application of a normative set of rules and rights, I observe a shifting conception of right and social justice with respect to the governmentality of the state. In this respect, I adopt a relational and processual approach to understand the politics of the poor in Delhi. I locate the struggles within an ensemble of social relations and institutional arrangements in Delhi in order to fully understand the politics of the poor. As I show throughout my book, the struggles of claiming citizenship entitlements are historically contingent and contextual. Numerical citizenship struggles draw on the commissions and omissions of different state agencies. The various organs of the state adhere to different principles of governance at different points in time, thereby creating a space for negotiation, participation, and resistance to state policies. These struggles are shaped by forms of speciality, social cleavages along the lines of caste, income, gender, regional origin, and community networks, and by the involvement of activists and interlocutors. So I'm not getting into the details of how they're shaped by these factors, but maybe I could respond to your questions if you have any. So numerical citizenship struggles involve an ensemble of individual and collective contentions that draw on the expediency of political mediations, negotiations over documents and inscriptions, legal battles in the courts, and a variety of performances of popular resistance. These struggles encompass a universe of politics that is counter-calculating, and they draw on shifting affective ties, interactions, and demonstrations among poor people, their allies, and their representatives. The social relationships and affective ties among community members change over time. The dynamic spatial and temporal dimensions of these struggles shape the transformation of social relationships, political arrangement, and domestic bonds that emerge from demolition and resettlement. The political subjectivities of the poor are continuously reconfigured in a dialectical relationship with state policies, especially when welfare and resettlement policies are being enacted. Furthermore, the change in political regime and legal discourses and practices underpin the modalities and outcomes of politics. Throughout the course of this book, I show how the quest of numerical citizenship is not homogeneous or unilinear, but rather uneven and multi-level. Finally, let me briefly share with you the contents of my book. In chapter 1, I provide a historical account of formal, abstract, and largely depoliticized character of planning regimes in Delhi. I analyze how an attempted passive revolution in urban planning, a reformist agenda to redistribute urban resources, was subverted by Jhuggi demolition policies during the implementation of the first master plan. Subsequently, I analyze how urban planning facilitated the expansion of capital accumulation and spaces of leisure for Delhi's middle and upper classes and enforced surveillance and ameliorative strategies for the poor. In chapter 2, I analyze the ideological and practical motivations that underlie the planning of demolition and resettlement to begin with. Then I examine the social suffering endured by the poor as a result of the structural violence of demolition and resettlement in order to provide the context to analyze numerical citizenship struggles in Delhi. In chapter 3, I examine how various kinds of intermediaries mobilize a kind of arithmetic calculus, that is to say, an assessment of the numerical strength of the poor in the neighborhood to demand space and infrastructure in the city. I address the tactics and techniques of 3 different kinds of intermediaries: neighborhood chiefs or pradhans, self-fashioned social workers or samas sevaks, and lower rung government workers or sarkari karmachari, who originate from and act on behalf of this informal settlement. The intermediaries possess a range of forms of capital and are defined by social identities and diverse sources of legitimacy and motivations. In order to gain access to welfare services and claim voting rights, Delhi's poor engage in documentary struggles to prove existence in Delhi. Chapter 4 examines how numerical citizenship is claimed, negotiated, performed, and realized through various documentary, inscriptive, and enumeration counter tactics. Here, enumeration counter tactics include letter writing, office visits, self-surveys, the felicitation of information through the right to information policy, as well as the processes of authentication and production of counterfeit documents. In chapter 5, drawing on two court cases, one against demolition and one for resettlement, I consider the contingent circumstances that shape the negotiation of law and legal outcomes in Delhi. Through an analysis of legal negotiations in everyday context, I explore how poor people navigate the judiciary by rejecting legal and social classifications, building social relationships and alliances, and contesting existing land use and class relations. With a focus on various exclusionary processes of urbanization and urban policies, Chapter 6 examines the cultural idioms and performances of resistance employed by Delhi's urban poor in citizenship struggles. I show that while the displays of numerical strength in these resistance demonstrations remain central, the protest events, especially felicitation ceremonies, contribute to the reinvention of community solidarity. And I show how militant protests are intelligently calibrated and mostly symbolic in nature, although they may entail direct verbal or physical attacks on specific targets. The conclusion explicates why the idea of numerical citizenship has analytical purchase. By evaluating theoretical and empirical resonances with the struggles of the poor in other megacities, I offer an approach to understanding citizenship and the right to the city. In identifying the merits and challenges of numerical citizenship, I emphasize the significance of demographic calculus, the contingency of collective solidarity, and the range of improvisational tactics for establishing numerical presence in the city. In so doing, the theory of numerical citizenship that I propose is attentive to the dynamic nature of social spaces, the temporal dimensions of struggles, and the salience of social divisions and alliances, and the heterogeneity of state practices that remain critical to understanding the political agency of the urban poor. I conclude with some remarks on how recent legislation passed by the Indian government, the Citizenship Amendment Act, and the subsequent plans to register citizens is affecting residents in my field sites, and the implications for the struggle for the right to the city. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanjeev, for that wonderful talk and for introducing all of us to your book, which I recommend everyone to read if you're interested in the question of city, citizenship, and documents and law and much, much more. So, initially, both I and Anwesha, who's also a dear colleague, we're supposed to do this to give comments on his book together. But then she's taken unwell, so what she did was she sent me her comments for the book. So and there was a lot of overlap between what both of our comments were. So then I've sort of clubbed them together, and I'll ask Sanjeev a question from both of us in this. Yeah. So yeah. So what Sanjeev's book does very well is that it talks about, and he's been speaking for a while. It tells us this very interesting story about claims of citizenship made through paper, made through documents, and he brings this very affective sense through which documentation becomes a way of performative politics, right? And how documents become the source, the axis, the locus in ways in which mostly the urban poor, they perform their citizenship. When we talk about poverty, what we also need to acknowledge is that the urban poor is not just poor in terms of resources, they're also document poor. So they also have, the documents are much more, let's say, um, susceptible to being denied sort of credibility. They're also more susceptible to, say, uh, floods and to fires and to theft and to very different kinds of ways in which their relationship to documents is very different from the way, say, we relate to our documents, right? The idea and for us, what we need to also keep in mind is that documents are often tied to what we call what is a permanent address and your proof of residence. So that those are uh, in extremely tentative urban lives, especially for the urban poor. The question of their relationship to documents is then translates to their precarity of life in general in the way they live their life in the city. So, right, what Sanjeev shows in this book is that citizenship is temporal, right? It's almost defined by this uh, time. It has a time-like quality uh, 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 to it, right? So even when you look at, say, how cutoff dates are treated, and okay, only on what basis are those cutoff dates decided? Who decides them? On what grounds? There are These are arbitrary documents. They're arbitrary in their definition. They're arbitrary in their implementation, and the tyranny of cutoff dates is it continues to have a material impact on people's lives. So what I thought this is very well said in your book, which is that you show that these documents are actually social relations, right? So it's not just a paper. These are ways in which people relate to each other, people relate to their communities, their localities, their understanding of how what their claims are in that city, in that locality, and to the state, to the MLA, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So, so here are some of our questions, which is that you tell us about three different kinds of settlements, right? One is a transit camp, another is a gypsy jockey. But then do these different documents that you talk of, right? Do they have a different kind of a bearing on political subjectivities and social subjectivities? So, for example, does an Aadhaar card allow for a different kind of a political subjectivity than, say, a ration card, right? What are those say relations then, if documents are indeed social, right? So then if you could tell us a little more about what your sense was that these different documents and what kind of relations these different documents forge with people. I was very fascinated by the Pradhan figures, right? Again, and they keep coming up in the urban studies literature, especially on Delhi. And I frequently wonder, see, who are these pradhans? Where do they come from? What is their source of authority? Right? Are they some um, older kind of you know birth assigned sense of authority, or is there something else that is happening here? If you could tell us a little more. And what is their role? So you also tell us about the pradhans are not necessarily the most reliable figures all the time. There's a lot of mistrust. There's a lot of um, anger sometimes, and yet the pradhans continue to be important figures in these negotiations with the state. So we would like to know more about what those relations are, what those assets are. You also say that what you write about this book in terms of the relationship with the document, it is beyond the NGO-driven politics. So um, if you could also shed light on what are the ways in which the NGOs sort of push the politics of documents as opposed to how the poor themselves sort of configure their own relationship with the document. So what are the divergences here? Why do you say that this is beyond the NGO-driven politics, and what do you mean by it? Yeah. Also, interestingly, we were thinking about the term urban poor, right? So this term remains central in your work, and you borrowed this from Nandini Gupta's foundational work on the politics of the urban poor, which is, those of your students are interested, it's one of those classic books on urban poor, which all of you should go and read. So there, Nandini Gupta defines urban poor as a way to encompass various occupational groups and to highlight the diversity and plurality of their employment relations and working conditions. But you also argue that the category of urban poor must be qualified, right? Since it intentionally implies specific vulnerability, right? So a Muslim uh, uh, is also an urban poor, but their vulnerability is very different from, say, a Dalit woman's vulnerability. So then, but how do you distance from that flattening of, say, urban poor? So if you could tell us a little more about that. You use this very interesting term, Raniti, right? Raniti, for those who are unfamiliar with Hindi, Raniti roughly translates as war strategy, right? So these are the strategies that the poor take up in order to respond to the state and how uh, uh, and to the continuous disenfranchisement through documents or without documents and so on and so forth. Um, so you show how sorry, um, so how is this, say, for example, uh, uh, relating to, say, something like category of politics of the governed, where he's talking of similar kinds of strategies that people take up, sometimes through marches, sometimes through negotiation, sometimes through court cases, sometimes by just flinging a stone through a window, right? So these are the different various ways that they take up. So how will, say, Raniti relate to or say different from the politics of the governed? I was also thinking of the other uh, uh, way in which politics of the poor is been mostly understood, but especially when it comes to housing, right? So one way is, of course, resistance to collective politics, to uh, uh, collective solidarity efforts, like, so for example, marches, dharnas, protests, etc., strikes, right? And the other, which has been talked about quite a lot in the last at least decade or so, which is the quiet politics of the poor, right? Which is occupancy urbanism, right? Where there is no necessary, say, obvious way of visible protest, but the poor slowly uh, uh, occupy spaces which are unauthorized, but they do it slowly, quietly, without necessarily um, uh, uh, making a quote unquote a noise, right? So then, where does this your work? So you're talking about all of this together. How do you situate your work in this literature, right? So yeah, something on that. And yeah, I was also thinking about so you talk about your fieldwork period 2011, right? I think you started in 2017. So you start in 20. Absolutely. So this is what I was looking forward to hear from you a little more, because this is um, 2011 onwards, and especially post 2014, we have seen a shift in the way the state uh, views the poor, or at least to some of us, right? So the way in which demolitions and, say, the attack on poor, especially in Delhi, right, with the kind of attack that we've seen since 2022, right? This has already been intensifying since, I'm guessing, 2016, 2017. It's only taken a particular form in 2022 onwards, when you see bulldozers being deployed, especially around G20, we saw massive demolitions. So how has the ranity of the poor therefore changed? Are they responding differently to this crisis? Are they seeing this differently? So on that note, I would just um, give you the mic and let you respond, and let's open up the questions to the
All right, thank you so much. These are very important questions. So I'll take a bit of time to clarify and elaborate. Thank you both, Dr. Sushmita Pati and Dr. Anwesha Ghosh, for coming up with these questions, which actually will allow me to elaborate and clarify some of the arguments and the very cryptic presentation I gave. So I'll sort of have this opportunity to maybe share a few ethnographic anecdotes or some clarifications about my main argument. Okay, so the first question has to do with documents and their relationship with settlement, right? So what is the relationship of documents with particular kinds of neighborhoods? Do these residents possess similar kinds of documents? Are they charged differently in different settlements? How do we understand rannitis or tactics and counter-tactics, especially in their documentary as well as linguistic strategies with respect to social spaces? Because I'm trying to argue that each social space would have a particular kind of dynamic, right? And that would sort of tell us something interesting about politics. So there's a lot to talk about here, but to just give you some concrete evidence or concrete examples, I mean, the primary document you need, and now of course you need Aadhaar card, the primary two documents you need are ration card and voter ID. And the new policy that was implemented set the cutoff date at 2015, and since then you need Aadhaar card, right? But these are not only the three documents which are actually important, because as Dr. Pati was mentioning, they are document poor, not just poor in terms of in a material way. So, poor people have to parade a whole host of documents to prove, their legitimate residency, right? So, for instance, you may have to show purchase sale affidavit, power of attorney document. You may show birth purchase. You may show all kinds of school living certificates. And these documents, that's why it's not a very impersonal, bureaucratic sort of strategy to document your presence, but rather you sort of deploy all kinds of rannitis to get documented, right? And you invoke memories of your co-residents. So the sequence of arrival, time, whatever, right? Or during communal claim. So you can see how documents are actually sort of positing a particular kind of social relationship, right? So in resettlement colonies and transit camps, these sale and purchase affidavits, the power of attorney documents become salient, but they may not become salient in a jhuggi-jhopri settlement, for instance, because they need, or so in jhuggi-jhopri settlement, for instance, renters, despite having all kinds of documents, cannot claim a resettlement plot or flat. Though the populist regimes actually made some sort of concession and the sort of, the AAP government actually rendered people who rented houses in jhuggi-jhopri settlements to be eligible, but I haven't seen any renter getting relocated. And I'm doing some work now in situ resettlement colonies now, following up with this. And there are all kinds of strategies how people now deploy, their tactics to sort of get counted. So you can see the moral charge of these documents and how a particular settlement would actually relate to it. Aadhaar card definitely has become very critical now. It was not before, so the biometric authentication and it's sort of getting connected with other kinds of issues not, and because they provide information to revenue department, which actually sort of give you domicile certificate. So you need to sort of um, track people, navigate these offices to see how different uh, 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 tactics actually play a role. But these are very impersonal technologies of the state, very absurd, very arbitrary. But then relationship building and alliances, and invoking memories, biographies, going to local leaders become critical sort of ways to document out. So, who are the pradhans and what are the sources of authority? So, as Dr. Pati was mentioning, a lot of people have actually worked on intermediaries, but I'm trying to sort of um, further differentiate this category called intermediary. So, I'm trying to sort of talk about three different kinds of pradhans, different kinds of intermediaries. So, I talk about pradhans who are known for their political capital. So, they kind of establish relationships with different political parties and different political leaders. And they are the first people who actually approach politicians to sort of take over a piece of land, or even if they have taken over a piece of land to occupy, then how do you contest, or how do you kind of undermine state violence or municipal violence if they're trying to erase your little duty. So they emerge from their neighborhood. And of course, they're differentiated in terms of caste, gender, and regional origin. You will find a lot of pradhans from different castes. Um, um, so basically, their source of legitimacy comes from the political capital they have, but they are an ambiguous category or figure because a lot of people do not trust them, and of course they support and help people, but they also create all kinds of dependencies and exclusion. Some aspects, on the other hand, are known for their relative cultural capital because they have had school education, they negotiate with NGOs, with advocacy groups that could articulate about plutocracy, nation state, democracy, right? So they are known for their linguistic competence, though that linguistic competence fails into insignificance when they are encountering classes higher up. And then they're known for a bureaucratic linguistic capital. I mean, sort of it's upset of state cultural capital. They know, the procedures of the state, how to get things done, and they do not like the level pradhan. So they aspire to get political capital, but they steer clear. We are samas seva. We do seva and we do help people. So they also demand a certain percentage of money or commissions or whatever. Government workers are known for their sort of linkages with government officers because they are working in the courts, in bureaucracy, in water department and all. So that's why they have that leverage. And you'll not find many female government workers. You'll find many female pradhans, and you'll not find many female samasevas. That's something I found. And it's gendered as well. So that there are all these masculinist idioms that pradhans saying that they do development work, and women do, female pradhans do ghareli samesya kind of work, right? Domestic problems related work. So there are all kinds of divisions there. So I've tried to sort of nuance all this and to tell you a story about how mediated politics, starting from building numerical strength and building locality, which is very key. It's not just an aggregate of or additive value of adding more people and demonstrating during elections and all, but also creating a locality and building collective solidarity. How do Muslims, for instance, build on their intra-community solidarity to create some sort of general class solidarity, because everybody is affected here. You may have all kinds of differences, but then you need Vaichara or Rishtadar, because the entire neighborhood will be demolished. So despite all these divisions, so that's something, so collective solidarity is very key. And not to say that people do not experience all this violence. And I've documented how Dalits face problems in terms of navigating bureaucracy, in terms of, in a climate of Islamophobia. I'm not getting into the details, but, there are all these divisions which are critical to understand. How is it different from NGO-driven politics, and what are the ways the NGOs push their agenda, and how do the poor negotiate? My primary goal was to understand the politics of the poor on their own terms, and I'm definitely drawing on Sanjeev Routray to talk about their autonomous strategies and tactics. And not a very top-down elitist take that poor people are guided, or So I'm trying to talk about the politics of the poor. Uh, Even when they are differentiated in terms of income, regional origin, possession of different kinds of documents, gender, caste, regional origin. So how do sort of they approach the state? How do they resist different technologies of the state which are really absurd or arbitrary? Or how do they participate with different structures of the state, right? So I'm trying to understand on their own terms, and then so their relationship with activists and NGOs are very complex. For instance, the poor people would actually distinguish NGOs as service, services providing NGOs and advocacy NGOs. So advocacy NGOs are celebrated. The service providing NGOs are seen as running shops or something. But then when they are dealing with advocacy NGOs, they also have a very complex relationship. For instance, I mean, the terms that come to my mind is that, advocacy NGOs or leaders actually are involved in path showing, consciousness raising and all. But these terms are not seen in abstract way. I mean, because they may connote an element of conditioning, right? That poor people are passively getting this. But so they sort of calibrate and by their own calculative decisions as well as affective ties. So sometimes they reject what the advocacy NGO leaders tell them. So that's a very intricate and complex relationship they have with NGOs. Let them be service providing NGOs or advocacy NGOs. And of course, these relationships are very ambiguous based on various kinds of calculations and affective ties. So did you ask me to qualify the category urban poor? Yeah. So I've done that. So of course, I draw on Nandini Guptu because Nandini Guptu did not use working class because it connotes a particular set of relations of production. But then a vast majority of the poor are informal sector workers, and of course Bernstein and then Johnny Perry and all those scholars have talked about classes of labor and all. But then how many classes and all? So Johnny Perry himself elaborates on that. So I thought, heuristically speaking, urban poor still encompasses, the category encompasses all these occupational groups you have, informal workers who are very precarious and all. But then I'm qualifying it further by talking about who are the most vulnerable, people who live in, say, unrecognized Yugi settlements. They could be demolished and they will not get anything from it. The poor on the pavement, for instance, they're just, they are part of the state governmentality, but they can only get night shelters, for instance, or say Muslims in an atmosphere of Islamophobia, right? Dalit women who are doing recycling work in neighborhoods, people who do not possess documents, or people who possess documents but are constantly burdened with orthographic anxiety because they have spelling anomalies or their documents are damaged or something, right? So you can see the vulnerabilities are shaped by all these factors. I'm missing out on many other things I'm talking about. For instance, those people who bought houses, they are maybe relatively better off economically, but they have problems proving that if the transit camp is demolished, they will be the first people to be affected because they may not get in situ resettlement or whatever, right? People who occupy the most lucrative places in the neighborhood, or people who are connected with political leaders. So you have to sort of see how it's not a homogeneous category, how heterogeneous the category urban poor is. Rannitis and how it's different from Pakistan. Of course, you can accept this question. Yeah. So I'm sort of trying to I'm definitely differing from his stance. Let me recollect what I've written about regarding this. So I agree with him that there's always this constant process of collective building solidarity, and there's a critical salience of community. But then he doesn't consider them as citizens, but he sort of considers them as populations, innumerable categories. So, but I'm trying to show no. I mean, that is setting it a little far. I think these people are actively participating as citizens, not within normative parameters of the state and judiciary, but in different ways, in very contextual and contingent ways. They claim as citizens. They take recourse to all kinds of paralegal and illegal ways of carrying out their activities, but they also martial laws, for instance. They go to the judiciary, they petition, they articulate their claim not just in a moral way, but as citizens, which are I mean and excuse me and rights that are constitutionally guaranteed and mandated, right? I differ from him in that perspective, in that way. For instance, Chatterjee would consider law as tyrannical, right? And popular politics was subverting law. But I show that it's two different cases, that law could be also used as a resource to fight against demolition or for resettlement. And I show how they do it. And not necessarily in a very conventional way of doing it, but through shaming, standing on the rooftop, all kinds of stuff, by articulating in different ways in courtrooms, by reclassifying yourself and recategorizing yourself as citizens. And there are many ways how they do it, celebrating and or felicitating a beneficent lawyer, and they do a whole host of things to claim their citizenship rights. But I do agree that you have to think through this in a different way, because they are outside the parameters of the bourgeois civil society, which I find is fascinating. That is a very important argument he's making. And I also nuance how this category is very differentiated, unlike Chatterjee is thematically giving, but I'm showing all the differences and all. That's how I differ from him. How do I differ from the arguments regarding occupation, white politics of the poor? Nobody asked, maybe you'd ask me a question about James Scott. I mean, he talked about seeing the state, and he recently passed away, and it looks like he was a very kind and nice person. So I'm really fascinated with kind and nice academics. So but I differ from his stance. That's because he's talking about zomia, uplands, and all, and fleeing the state always. But you are talking about Delhi, right in the middle of everything, right? And people are not fleeing the state because they are in the queue in front of ration offices. They're in the queue in front of Delhi Urban Shelter Improvement Board, right? Even the Orang Laos, the three gypsies he talks about. I'm not so sure. For instance, I could give you, I teach this article to my students by Tim Banel and Alice Na, and they talk about Orang Aslis and Settingan. So Orang Aslis are indigenous people, and Settingan are squatters, and squatters would be mostly Tamils and Chinese, migrant workers in Malaysia. And they show how they are doing all kinds of stuff. They're trying to claim that they're urban pioneers. They were the first people to settle, so the state is pushing them away. So what James Scott is doing, and he has done such wonderful work in terms of telling us how subterfuge is carried out, what kind of perversion people do, what kind of insubordination people carry out in their day-to-day life, right? And there's a fascinating, colorful accounts of how people do this by remaining invisible, by fleeing the state. And I don't discount that. But the context I'm talking about is very different, because here people are actually, lining up and all. Even there is, yeah, I'll stop there because then I can go on and on. Okay, so how has it become different now? And I'm sort of doing some follow work, but in a completely different neighborhood. Of course, one key aspect of my work is has to do with conjunctures. So I'm trying to show how different conjunctures would produce different kinds of state calculative strategies, and they would actually give rise to different kinds of policies. So, so, and and conjuncture is a specific period of time, or it's a combination of forces and relationships that come into being and that create a particular setting, right? To just simplify what conjunctures are, and it's a term popularized by Stuart Hall and others, but initially proposed by Gramsci, though he talked about organic and capitalist features shaping everything, and conjunctures are continuous. But then there is now a lot of emphasis on how conjunctures actually shape particular kinds of politics. So I show how, for instance, a passive revolution in urban planning, a new social formation came into being in 1950, Nehruvian modernism, will not demolish slums, will contest segregation, colonial segregation. But then how that conjuncture gave rise to other kinds of stuff, what was happening, the Jhuggi demolitions are still happening, what happened during the conjuncture of emergence, a combination of forces and relationships, some sort of authoritarian populism, some sort of authoritarian populism, psychophancy, all those forces came together, and that affected, for instance, predominantly Muslim population during emergency, right? And I'm forgetting the figures, but I've written in my book, like 50,000 people were resettled between 50 or 70, and 150,000 people were resettled just during those 2 years, during that conjuncture, right? So likewise, you had a neoliberal conjuncture, right? A contradictory ideology about modernism, bourgeois environmentalism, to use Amitav Aviskar's word, to make Delhi a world-class city, a heritage city, and all those ideas and ideologies, contradictory ideologies, gave a particular concept. And what's happening now, right, is a very critical question. And post 2022 or whatever, what happened after CA? Has the state become technocratic? What is the place of the Muslims? So these are things one has to understand, to understand the politics of the poor and how. But I still think, even if there is hypervisibility of Muslims, I don't think they lead a district life and demonstrate it through the example of Kagas Nahi Dikhayenge and Shaheen Bagh protest. That was not an invisible kind of protest. And I would like to argue that it's not that because the nature of the state changes, the verdicts change, the legal discourses change. That doesn't mean that a particular population should play cat and mouse game. No, that's not democracy then. And we are still talking about a particular kind of faulty but democracy still, ethnocratic state. But then, how do you understand this? And I have been having debates with a lot of scholars and a lot of people about it. Yeah, okay, I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Sanjeev, for those responses. Do we have questions? I see curriculum in hand, and I see, okay, so curriculum, will you go first, and then take a few. Yeah.
So basically, I was curious, for certain communities or groups, like for example, you have been mentioning like Dalits or Muslims, irrespective of if I describe class in a certain way. The based on the typical consumption based middle class or lower income class, I'm not getting into it, but largely based on even classes. So people kind of live in certain neighborhoods even when they migrate. So it could be like a Jhuggi Jhopdi, or it could be some other locality as well. So when you talk about poor in terms of documentation, so just to be part of the city, there are many extra legal or pseudo formal, whatever you can call it, property regimes or tenancy systems in many states across like India. So there is always a question because of legitimacy, like legitimacy of those in certain, like though in certain cases they are acknowledged by the state, but given how like regimes change, like so their legitimacy again becomes a question because they may not be accepted. So in such situations, How do you find your case in terms of this urban poor, which is document-based poor kind of a thing, different? Because what is new or unique to this kind of a settlement? Because this could actually be translated to other kind of settlements as well. Like, for example, a certain ghetto or a certain enclave, similar situation would be existing. So that was my question.
Yeah. Sir, you spoke about the normative parameters of the state for determining citizenship. Clarify a little more on what that means and how that manifests in the daily, the normative parameters for citizenship. Could you speak more on that and how the intermediaries and the judiciary is trying to bridge the gap between how the citizens themselves are taking control of this citizenship and providing new meaning to it? And is there a hope in the future for there to be a bridge in the gap between the state and the citizens? And through what means can that be achieved? Yeah. So when we talk of cities in India, we know that they're already very densely populated. So when we're locating the idea of, resettlement and locating the urban poor in a physical space, we will also talk about their housing. Housing needs for the urban poor and how they're living in temporary settlements, and they probably have to be moved to a more permanent settlement along with being given an identity. So those are related aspects. And even when they're sometimes resettled, you'll see these buildings that the government is creating and where they're situated. And then there are debates on how the buildings don't really reflect their needs as a community. Like we, there are discussions on how women feel more restricted in those spaces compared to other people. Like their freedom is restricted in certain places, like the resettlement buildings, and how like that goes against like their needs. And there's also the idea of community building because there are these separate housing spaces that are created and the linkages that were there existing in the temporary settlement that have changed entirely. So how do you look at these issues in the need for resettlement? And even when the resettlement happens, it's very like one-stop solution and the buck stops there. What about their integration into the larger community? Like there are further discussions that needs to be there in those particular angles. So
Thank you for those questions. I mean, I hope I understood those questions. The first question has to do with extra legal properties and different tenancy systems and how they would be affected. They may not get affected today, but they may get affected tomorrow. Right? That's the question, right? Yeah, and that's why I think that's why I think uh, this idea of conjuncture has analytical purchase. And we need to really understand these social formations and state practices through this idea of conjuncture. Um, and how difference in the populist government may allow something or may not allow something. How particular deeds, Delhi government hasn't given yet, property deeds to people. But I suppose in Odisha there are some talks about giving property deeds to people. Uh, you know, um, our politics is very distinct from Congress politics. They try to do certain things, and I could clarify or elaborate if you want me to do. So that's why, so each regime would reflect a particular kind of calculative rationality. And we are talking about poor people who actually come and settle. Um, uh, and, and of course, there are unauthorized colonies that Dr. Pati would perhaps tell you more. And I've gained from understanding, what are the types of settlements and how. So those and the politics in unauthorized colonies be very different and different. Uh, and from the and of course, a few poor people live in unauthorized colonies as well. They buy properties, and the poverty is just not specialized in the kinds of neighborhoods I talked about, but also in unauthorized colonies as well. So each space should perhaps give you a very distinct flavor, a distinct kind of politics. So so I still think that just trying to think through what you are suggesting, that documentation and political relationships, alliance, community building, neighborly relationships, and how that could act as undermine the bulldozer bras or whatever, could play a major role in terms of claiming a right to the city. The documentation perhaps would be also very key there, even if there are different other sovereignties, even if they are beyond the parameters of state sovereignty in terms of their legality or illegality. Right.
So actually, what I was asking along with this about the uniqueness in your site, because for example, if I take the case of Jamia Nagar, a certain kind of a settlement, and then the kind of jhuggi jhopris like you are looking at. So if one of these such colonies is, for example, Muslim dominated, so Jamia Nagar is also different nature of a settlement, but it is Muslim dominated. So if the regime, the government regime is constant, like if you keep that constant, that both the common regime in both operating in both the localities. So is the process is similar, the politics similar, or does it vary with the nature of the neighborhood that you are looking at?
It will vary in terms of the nature of neighborhood, because you are talking about housing rights here, and Delhi doesn't have a clear plan in terms of or reordering land relations. So this is how poor people actually make their way or gain a foothold in the city. So what is the way to get a legal home in the city? If you're a pavement dweller, you cannot. So you need, even if you are living in an unrecognized jhuggi settlement, you cannot. If you are under constant state of getting demolished, and you will not get anything, even if you have lived there for 10, 12 years. So definitely the politics should change. And in this episode, I mean, who lives in these places, or who live in these spaces? Of course, predominantly the population is the Dalit population, right? And statistically proven, and OBCs, and then some dominant caste members. And of course, some pockets would have a significant Muslim population. And so there are issues of redistributive politics as well as identity politics in terms of their claims. I've sort of briefly addressed that. Okay, should I move on to the slide? Thank you. Okay, so normative parameters, and what do I mean by that? So, in liberal theory, the state is a dispenser of, rights, welfare, and all, and there are programmatic policies. The state will carry out certain things and all, and anything else beyond that is seen as failure, seen as lacking or something like that. This is how things are theorized. India is lacking, India is corrupt, or these are, and so a lot of global South scholars are trying to critique that and trying to show that because the dynamics are so different here, and you could, and that's why I dropped from Kaviraj in strategy, sequential theory and symmetrical theory of modernity. How these are very sort of idiosyncratic practices people have, or say, for instance, patronage politics is looked down upon. It's not part of the normative parameter state. But then people are actually negotiating with the state through various means, and they do understand the opaqueness of the state, but they navigate the judiciary, they navigate the state in different ways, not necessarily through normative practices, but authenticating or counterfeiting the documents, for instance, or through mediated politics, which allows them to subsist, but which also create all kinds of dependence. So beyond institutionalized avenues, they carry out all kinds of practices. So for instance, as a Bayatu talked about non-institutional practices, a quiet enforcement of the ordinary on the property class. And that's because he's talking about a particular kind of context, Middle East, mostly. But here, people are marshalling legal resources. They are going to lawyers, beneficial lawyers. They are doing patronage politics, or engaging with authenticating their documents or counterfeiting the documents. And that is how you have to understand, to have a contextual understanding of what's going on the ground. And if you have a bottom-up approach to understand what really happens, how do people claim a foothold? I'm not romantic. Only 25% of the people get research. most of them are under constant threat of demolition, right? Most of them do not end up getting a resettlement plot or house, right? The housing rights are always undermined. Yes. Depending on different kind of context and conjuncture, the neoliberal policies, you see 25%, I mean, I am recently doing a field work in an institute neighborhood, 3,000 people got demolished, 1,600 got eligible. That's a huge chunk of people. And that would sort of tie up with the question we had about needs, right? So what is happening in this building, for instance? And we see how gendered these policies are. Who inherited these properties, for instance, right? You and earlier times you're giving plots of land, and people could accommodate their families by building additional stores, right? And of course, resettlement colonies would always have gendered unequal vulnerabilities because women cannot go and work because of safety issues. So the first 10, 15 years of their lives are actually constrained because of all these issues. There are all these unequal vulnerabilities women would face. And if you have gone to any resettlement colony and interviewed people, they'll talk about the kinds of things that happened in the first few years of resettlement, right? But now, for instance, I mean, what are the needs? You are resettling, say, a family comprised of two brothers, two sisters, and parents in a 25 square meter flat. And we're looking at the kinds of conflicts and what is going on and what are who gets what and how gendered they are. And so we sort of, I'm trying to examine that now.
So let's have 4 more and let's keep our questions as short as possible. So Dayal, I saw your hand. Yeah. Please.
Hi, Sanjeev. Very interesting talk. I haven't read the book, so my question is out of certain curiosity. So I'm thinking, as an ethnographer yourself, you are also in turn being part of this politics of visibility, right? You're documenting it, you're categorizing the things. So how are your respondents perceived as a researcher, and how do you reflect yourself as being part of this, the other politics of poor in a very different way?
You had a question? Yeah, good.
My question is basically you placed a lot of emphasis on performative resistance, how these communities try to perform processions and symbolic processions. But so recently, with the current dispensation across states and centers, we've seen this bulldozer politics kind of stuff going on. And ultimately, the politics of documentation does exist. So how far do this resistance politics in terms of performativeness go to actually giving legal challenges to this kind of documentation classifications?
Yeah.
Good evening, sir. So you talk about how numerical citizenship is again a very political process as well. And I've been reading a lot about regularization schemes, regularization of slums. And usually what we see is again it's under the discretion of the municipality who gets selected, who gets regularized. And while they do get regularized, they still remain unauthorized because they're still outside the original plan. How does, again, in your ethnographic encounters, how have you seen this relationship between how does the urban poor interact with local government in itself?
Thank you. So about the politics of visibility and how that relates to an ethnographer. Incidentally, I'm actually completing a paper in terms of my ethnographic experiences and encounters. So how did I gain access to people? What kind of relationships did they do? The issues of validation, and I sort of try to argue that despite structural features in terms of our privileges or, and there's this constant dialectic between our positionalities and agency and personality. So, and also a chance of luck. And that is something I'm elaborating based on my experience in BDA Vikas Mina. So, how did people perceive me? And so let me recall it. So there's a lot of anecdotes I'm sort of sharing in that piece. in terms of how they viewed me as an NGO worker, as a surveyor, as a political spy, as somebody who is documenting their struggles, as somebody who could possibly go and carry out sting operations, and so I was kind of, and if you ask me how did I approach them, but that would lead to a different sort of conversation. Maybe you could have that after, I draw a bit from Pierre Bourdieu and what kind of socially constituted predispositions you have and how you can challenge that and go and negotiate, understand, and how do you understand, silences in the field, how do you work with a heterogeneous community, how do you say adopt a term I use, guerrilla techniques, research techniques to sort of avoid the most authoritative and dominant and hegemonic groups of people who would ask you to just interview their friends or dominant caste or dominant communities. So these are things I've dealt with in terms of how you are seen and whether you can be invisible, whether you're trying to evade because there are people who want you to talk to only their people. There's one person who actually kept a surveillance on me. Wherever I go, he follow me. And what kind of relationship building is possible in that kind of context when you are interacting and building relationship over a long period of time with a diverse and heterogeneous community. If you're seen with some people, what are the other people thinking? Can you practice impartiality? Or can you sort of borrow the vocabulary from feminist anthropologists or methodologists and talk about mutuality, reciprocity? Are they possible? What are the challenges? What are the conundrums? There are no easy answers. So I've written a reflective piece on that. Maybe I'll share that with you, and you'll get a sense of how I'm doing that. Okay. So next question was on performative resistance, and so in my book, I'm actually the core thing is not resistance as such, because in Delhi, so the outright verbal or a militant kind of resistance happened just one time when transit camp was about to be demolished. Sabko bahar aana hai, transit camp ko bachana hai, or आवाज दो हम एक पे हमला, सब पे हमla. So they are linguistic expressions, right? And then cut branches of the tree, put them on the road, have road blockades and all, give fiery speeches and all. So these are very rare occasions, and militant protests are unheard of in Delhi. So rather, I'm actually looking at, so these are practices which are there, and poor people would actually would take a recourse to that. If all the avenues are gone, right? But then it also depends on the kind of numerical strength, the kind of relationship you have with the politicians, the kind of media support you have, so all kinds of combinations, all the combination. For instance, in Azad Resettlement Colony, they had a Rasta Roko road pocket, just 25 people, and the police came and drove them out. But Sitapuri Transit Camp, when they were protesting, there were like 20,000 people on the road, and all kinds of. So if you read my book, you'll get a sense of what I'm trying to do when I talk about resistance politics. But it's not centering on resistance as a militant, or even if not a militant, but as a peaceful resistance. That's one chapter. I'm talking about cultural idioms and practices, and spectacles, and linguistic expressions, the fiery speeches they give, the dharna. So this is just one aspect. But the other aspect is the everyday politics of mediation, the everyday politics of dealing with inscriptive and documentary studies, the mediated politics or everyday politics of the law, how law is mastered. If law doesn't come to their rescue, what do they do? How law itself is such a variegated, arena in terms of, today the judgment is something, tomorrow the judgment is something else. And you have to just give you a background of what's happening with Gautam Nagar. So, 223 people were sort of evicted. Finally, that's an intricate process. We read the chapter on law, and finally, 94 people, after a lot of struggle, it was demolished in 2009, February 5th, if I remember correctly, right? And until now, they have not been resettled. That's because the PWD, the landowning agency, did not commit the money. And now they have given 9 crores, I suppose, but for 94 people. because 94 people are rendered eligible, right? So that's an intricate process. Okay, so and then the final question, unauthorized colonies, and is that discretionary? Well, I mean, of course, so we have, I mean, one can contest this Weberian idea of, impersonality, rules, hierarchy, and all that, but, and of course, there is a discretionary factor playing a huge role here. But how does a colony, unauthorized colony or a judicial colony get recognized or identified and gets into the database of the state is a very, very complex and intricate process. It's just not the discretionary power of the municipality or the state, but rather a whole host of relationships. What is the relationship between the settlement and the host community to begin with? Are they letting the fledgling settlement stay there or not to begin with? What is happening with the police and the low-level municipal authority? How do they negotiate with the councillor? How do they negotiate with the MLA? Do the councillor and MLA represent the same political party? So that's an intricate process. Have they gone to the court? What are the judgments of the court? So that is something one has to understand to really understand how a particular, numerical strength could be one of the key sort of thresholds of, but then there are a lot of factors. That is something I'm trying to nuance and sort of argue. So one has to understand why and under what circumstances a particular settlement or colony gets regularized.
Running parallel to your observations, I've been in the construction industry for over 20 years in Bangalore. I think my question would be like, you cannot use the word poor as a very, broad term. It has to be more like economically weaker sections. We have to grade them because Article 19, you have a right to settle anywhere as a person. Article 21 gives you the right to housing intrinsically to experience life in a different way. But here, what is happening is the poor people or the economically weaker sections of people, when they come from different parts of the country, are they willing to reveal their dual identity? Because we, as simple as I've had around 150 or 200 people who have wanted to get an insurance for them, they would not want to take an insurance because they have dual identity. And the reason for that is they don't feel belonging. So they will hold identity or voter identity cards in their state, but never want to get an insurance, state insurance, the ESI in this state. So I think there is a need for a lot of gradation that needs to happen to identify who the poor is for economically weaker sections of the society. We have the people who work in construction. 60% of your country's population is coming from the farm sector, and they are transitory. They are here for 3 months. They work for 3 months in construction. They go back for 3 months and they come back. So that's the cycle they follow, and they will not let go of their, identities of the state they live in. And another point I have observed is which land are they settled in the city? If you take Bangalore, for instance, all the poor people or the economically weaker sections live on government land. It is government land. And then we have the newspapers coming up and telling, bulldoze to them. No, government has to give them a place to stay. I understand that. But they're all government land, first of all. So there, I think, a lot of gradation may be required. And we need, like the way we have socially oppressed classes, and that is gradation. I think we need to classify the poor as economically sectional. Are you looking at doing something like that in your book? Because it looks more broad. Right.
Yeah. So I just wanted to know about. So there is, you will see that when it comes to the claims, the housing claims are sort of the state sort of accepts it a housing claim, but if you say this land, they will like no, we cannot give it. The obvious answer is that the land prices are so high and there are classifications that they cannot convert. So my question is going beyond the land prices and the obvious answer. Why is there in the state, because when it comes to titling mostly, because there is a differentiation within the bureaucracy, because the
land department works differently and the politicians work differently, or the agency who is taking, like, let's say HUD is working differently, do they not come together? What was your experience when it comes to giving houses, and when it came to giving land, whether they worked all together, where it was land was successfully claimed? Oh, and a little bit about housing.
Okay, thank you for those two questions. So, I mean, how do you define the poor? And I've struggled, I'm still struggling, and I'm writing a book on the plumbers. And how do you conceptualize the plumbers? Would they constitute or comprise of a distinct class? I'm still struggling. I'm sort of fine with Bernstein's idea of the classes of labor, Johnny Perry's work, Nandin Gupta's work. So I do recognize what you're saying, that, you know, not to sort of nuance it further, and how do you, of course, there are economically weaker classes and all, and the kind of dual identity you talked about, I didn't quite get it. So are you trying to suggest that they may not be poor, but they claim they're poor?
See, they're all settlers in the city for work. Okay? And they're all migrants.
Yeah.
And from different states they come in, so they have a voter ID.
Right.
In Bangalore,
Okay,
we
got
have a great population from Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, and Andhra.
Right.
And all of them have dual voter ID.
Okay.
And the politics uses it in a very different way.
Yeah. Got it. So in the Juki Jhopdi, so the primary sort of attempt is to have ration card, and now that there is this question of deduplication, right? And that's why Aadhaar was introduced, and I don't know what's going on there. But your question actually addresses a talk I'm giving tomorrow, and that is titled "Poor the Construction Worker." Right? And with Dr. Himanshu, we tried to create a union of plumbers, you know, and sort of we went around because I did ethnographic research for a year, but then later on so we are interested to sort of build a union of the plumbers, and we have named it as Delhi Odia Plumbers Union, and we're successful giving almost 100 identity cards. A lot of people do not like labor cards, so they are referred as labor cards. But we're not able to sort of register it for many reasons. And of course, the construction workers, the plumbers, most of them belong to one particular district in Odisha. And they have been living in the city for so long. When I was doing fieldwork among them, not a single person who actually had a labor card or identity card. And you know, there is a panoply of rights they can get from the labor board. There is Delhi, there is Building and Other Construction Workers Welfare Act, and each state has a Building and Other Construction Workers Welfare Board. But none of them was registered. And it's not because they wanted to just, you know, claim their welfare rights back in the villages, which is true. And that's why one of the chapters I'm writing on the plumbers has to do with how we understand agency rights in a trans-regional framework. So on the eve of each and every election, they'll go back and campaign and canvass and do all kinds of stuff. And luckily, I was there for 3 different elections. Recently, I was there in May as well. Did not spend a lot of time, but in 2017, there was Gram Panchayat elections, and I spent a lot of time, and most of them would actually go there and do that. And my question is why? Why would you do that? And why would not you do this in Delhi? And in Delhi also they do it, but mostly the contractors or subcontractors. And there are many reasons why they do it. I'm not getting into the details. So, so you know, perhaps you know, sort of differ from case to case, and of course, a lot of the people actually return back during old age. In fact, most of the people I interviewed and I met when I'm trying to trace them back in resettlement neighborhoods or transit camps, their children live, but they have returned back to their villages because of paucity of space, of ill health, and social reproduction work carried out by, you know, ungendered and, you know, back in villages. So, and now what is Aadhaar going to do? What is going on? That is something I'm not very clear about. But you're right in raising this question. But with Odia plumbers, it is a completely different case. yeah, they hardly had any document in Delhi. I'm talking about two different communities. One community comprised of two intermediate staff. They at least have, they started getting documents, but the Dalit community, they absolutely did not have any documents. So they only see this as a temporary stay, or and then they'll go back and build a concrete house and settle down. Yeah. Sorry, what is it? Oh, land. Okay. Thank you. The governance in Delhi is very complicated, and so we are talking about housing rights through these ideas of settlement, resettlement, getting a legal home, basically, right? And the governance structure is so different. See, DDA under the central government. So the central government has land and law now, right? The state government has municipality corporation. Municipality corporation provided services between 50 and 70, whatever, and from 77, DDA provided services until 2010. From 2010, now they have started, they have this organization called Delhi Urban Sector Improvement Board. So, so there are all these conflicts, and then there is a state government which has policies, housing policies, but then there are central government, they have Pradhan Mantri, Awas Yojana, JNN, URN. So how they sort of tally with each other. Delhi doesn't have the 70-foot. I mean, so what kind of land titling would happen? Who gets this? This is a very complicated process, unlike Bhubaneswar, for instance, or other places, right? For instance, there's 94 people in Gautam Nagar are not getting resettled, despite the PWD giving them the money finally. PWD, Public Works Department, right? Yeah, that's the landowning agency, right? It did not. They won the case in 2017, December, I suppose. But from 2017 to 2024, PW kept on denying, and they went, and then PWD agreed to give 9 crores or whatever. The state government, officials are saying, look, the resettlement is now done by the central government. And because there's a central government now that they want to sort of project that, somebody has given this house, right? So if you go to this resettlement in situ neighborhood, there'll be a picture of someone, and I've given this house, checking hands with the leaders and all. So that is going on now. So now you can see how complex this process, and Delhi is a very peculiar case. It doesn't have full statehood. That's why it's giving rise to all these complications and complexities.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and especially thank you, Sanjeev, for that wonderful talk and for all these fascinating ways of looking at the everyday lives of the poor that we don't quite understand very well. So thank you for those insights, and I'm sure we'll all pick up your book and read it. Thank you so much, everyone, and see you for our next event.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Thank you for the great questions. Thank you.